basically Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy are getting drafted immediately next to each other. Basically, there's no differentiation whatsoever in the markets between Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy. My guess is you think there should be a pretty significant gap between the two.
I do. I mean, first things first, it's Andy Reid. Rookies, like Rashee Rice. It's so easy to forget because the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, and so people focus on the playoffs, where what you saw was obviously Mahomes and Kelce are the centerpiece of that offense. Then it was Rashee Rice. But that was not the case the first half of the season, really the first 9-10 games. And Andy Reid's always been that way, based on the data we have and what I see on film too. He separates versus man, and he does his best work at the intermediate levels of the field, which is where Mahomes loves to throw. Mahomes, for all the hype about his arm, he's a decent deep ball guy. He's not a great one. He doesn't throw an incredible deep ball, even when he's got time to set up in the pocket. And you see him working on it throughout the years, but it's just not what he does best. He can make throws no one else really can make, but in terms of consistency with the deep ball, that's just not his jam. I think Brown is a really good fit for everything that they ask their receivers to do. And there's just so much more polish at this point because Worthy's a rookie. Such a silly thing to base things on. But you see Hollywood Brown going to Mavs games with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. You see him working out with Patrick Mahomes. He's in a contract year. I've got every reason to believe that he signed with the Chiefs in a contract year on a 1-year deal based on being told, hey, you're going to be our guy. And his skill set says it. I would put a full round or two, at least, difference between the two of them because I think the target differential will likely be that heavy, at least during the first half of the season, barring something crazy.
What? Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Kansas City's bringing the deep ball back. Yep. Seriously. Patrick Mahomes has been one of the league's biggest checkdown merchants in recent years, out of necessity. They want to change that this offseason, but will the Chiefs' new acquisitions at the wide receiver position help? And is it fair that Travis Kelce is no longer being drafted as the tight end one in many best ball leagues? Seth Kaiser from the Chief in the North newsletter has insight into all of it. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Fantasy Points channel for 32 breakdowns of 32 NFL teams. This is Franchise Focus, Kansas City Chiefs. Seth, last year on the podcast, on the show, I think we didn't even talk about Patrick Mahomes. I'm just like, what is there to talk about? And I think we can still take that approach, but the Chiefs are coming off their third Super Bowl of the Patrick Mahomes era, but something interesting has happened, and I'm sure Chief fans noticed this. Patrick Mahomes had a 6.7 average depth of target on throws last year per Fantasy Points data, which is the lowest of his career. It was actually the second lowest in the NFL among quarterbacks who started 10 or more games. Only Joe Burrow, interestingly enough, had a lower one. And it's been a trend. From Mahomes' first year in the league to now, his ADOT has consistently gone down. And it's just been stylistically, I think, how the Chiefs have chosen to play because they're still winning football games. But then comes this offseason. Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who in theory was a deep threat, is gone. Marquise Brown is in. Xavier Worthy, who was the fastest player at the Combine, is in. Do you think that is going to signal a sea change as to how the Kansas City Chiefs play offense in 2024?
Your timing could not possibly be better because I literally just published probably an hour ago an article entitled, and I quote, "Can Mahomes and the Chiefs revive the deep ball?" Examining the biggest question of the offseason for Kansas City's three-peat quest. So you're spot on there. One thing that's worth noting when you talk about some of the deep ball struggles that they had, their completed air yards per attempt, it depends on what site you use, of course, was 2.7 yards, which is even lower and is demonstrative of the fact that not only were they rarely throwing the ball down the field, when they even tried, they were not successful. Because otherwise, what would happen is that average depth of completion, it would get dragged up by a 40, 50 yard or here and there. But even when they tried it, they rarely had success with it. Last season, it was a culmination of a bunch of things that just went wrong in Kansas City. They made a bet on Kadarius Toney. They made a bet on Sky Moore. Those were kind of their young guys that they were going to develop that they really thought were going to be, their two of their top three receivers. And they made somewhat of a more quote unquote safe bet on Marquez Valdes-Scantling, basically playing at the same level that he played in 2022, which wasn't great, but it was fine. It was a decent deep threat, just enough to stretch the field enough for Juju Smith-Schuster and Travis Kelce to work underneath. And then none of it worked out, right? And one thing that people often make the mistake of, and this can apply for fantasy purposes particularly, is that, people assume that average players in the NFL are just always average, right? There's always that this is what they did last year. But really average players, they generally just are more up and down. And MVS had a down year. And when that happened, and then Sky Moore didn't develop how they were hoping, and Kadarius Toney didn't develop how they were hoping, it was just... It was a catastrophe. Their number one receiver through the first half of the season was Justin Watson. Mm-hmm. And if you're thinking, who? Well, that's not, he's a guy who belongs in the NFL, certainly. Ideally, he's your wide receiver 5, maybe wide receiver 4. He's a guy who you could bring onto the field when you're running 4 verts, who can occasionally stretch the field, but not really, okay? It got really, really, really bad. And what you pointed out, and I think this is a point that people are trying to figure out, what was 2023? Was it the culmination of what they've seen for several years where the Chiefs, Mahomes' depth of target was going down, down, down every year as teams started playing more and more conservative shells, as teams started just playing just 2 deep variations constantly. When they played quarters, it was all off. They were always trying to stop the big play from happening. And that was, of course, that started during the Tyreek Hill era in Kansas City. And then what you saw in 2021, there were a bunch of articles written about it. Have they figured out how to stop Mahomes? Well, then he just turned Tyreek Hill into a glorified possession receiver, and it worked. And the offense still stayed one of the best in the NFL. And so then in 2022, same thing. Depth of target drops even lower, but they were able to threaten downfield just enough with MVS to keep teams from really squishing, to use a non-applicable term at all, the shallow and intermediate portions of the field that let Kelce and Juju Smith-Schuster eat. Then when MVS takes a step backwards, so they still had the number 1 offense in the league. Still were very efficient, just hardly ever any big plays. You hit one every other game, team stayed back off, it all worked. Then 2023, MVS takes a step back, no one else steps up, and suddenly you don't have any legitimate deep threat at all. And as you know, football is a game where if you pull on one lever, it pulls 20 other levers in the room. And that's particularly true when you can't threaten all 3 levels of the field. And that's what you saw happening here in Kansas City last year. Teams started to really squeeze them. Their worst performance of the year, Christmas Day against the Raiders, everyone saw it. It was on national TV. The Raiders basically just crushed at the line of scrimmage, everything horizontal, and haloed Travis Kelce in coverage, and really tried to focus on Rashee Rice, who's a good player, but isn't necessarily a man separator or a deep threat. And they said, we dare you to beat us intermediate or deep. And Mahomes didn't trust Sky Moore, didn't trust MVS, and for good reason. Some of the times he just wasn't throwing them the ball even when they were open. And you had just the most horrendous offensive performance I've seen during the Mahomes era. So now, like you said, we fast forward, they pick up Hollywood Brown, they draft Xavier Worthy. Their entire intention here, the assumption is Rashee Rice is probably going to be suspended for approximately half the season, give or take. The assumption here is what they're really trying to do is imitate at a higher level what they did in 2022. Have an underneath guy in Rashee Rice and an underneath guy in Travis Kelce, and then have guys that can threaten over the top, hopefully, ideally, better than MVS and more consistently. One big difference between MVS and Hollywood Brown, who is the clear plan for their number 1 wide receiver at this point. That's the very clear plan for them moving forward, barring, Xavier Worthy blowing the doors off the place, which is tough to do in an Andy Reid offense. the idea with him is that unlike MVS, he's a guy who can win against man coverage and can also win intermediate routes, which is where he actually does his best work on film. So what you see here, they are trying to really make a return to force defenses to go back to those shells to where Mahomes can dice them up underneath, which he's very comfortable doing now. So it's a long road to a short thought that you can see. I mean, talk about going for an archetype this offseason.
Yep.
It's like, okay, only guys who run 4.3 or less need apply, and that's what they went to go do. So that's clearly the goal. It's one of the few times where offseason comments like the one we have from Mahomes, where he talked about this in the Pat McAfee show. He talked about this to local KC media about bringing back the deep ball. Usually it's just a lot of yapping in the offseason. You know, they say all the things, you know, we want to be a fast physical team as opposed to, you know, slow week one. And in this case, I really do think this is their primary push. It's one reason they were willing to let L'Jarius Sneed walk out the door so they could bring in Hollywood Brown on a one-year deal. They're figuring if the defense gets 10% worse, but the offense gets 50% better, overall they'll be a better team than they were last year as they try to three-peat.
So when you watched Xavier Worthy's tape, our guy Brett Whitefield, who does our prospect guide, and he really dug into all of Worthy's tape. He actually had some concerns about his ability to track the deep ball, and a lot of Texas fans said to him, you know what, you're right. He was actually better as an underneath receiver, while others said our quarterback, Quinn Ewers, who's on the cover of the college football game, by the way, was not the best at throwing the deep ball. So that's going to make the numbers look a little bit kind of skewed negatively to Xavier Worthy, despite that 4.2 speed. When you watched him, what was your impression of the kind of player he is?
So I would agree that, so similar to Hollywood Brown, when you get a smaller receiver who has a blazing fast 40 time, what you're generally going to think of is down the field.
Deshaun Jackson, yeah.
Yep, you're Deshaun Jackson. I do think Worthy did some of his best work, similar to Brown, at the intermediate levels of the field. In terms of tracking the ball down the field, I would place him in that in-between category. I don't think he was elite at it the way you would see with some guys, but I did see multiple plays where he was able to, what I always watch for is, you know, can they get their head turned and they maintain speed, or at least don't lose too much of a gear, and then, you know, don't fall over, which is what you and I would do if we tried to sprint with our heads turned. And then can they track where it's going to run underneath it to make the ball look more accurate than it was? That's, you know, deep ball accuracy, people joke around, is a receiver stat. Tyler Lockett is a prime example of that. He makes every deep ball look accurate because he tracks it better than anyone else. I wouldn't put him at that level, but I also wouldn't say he's bad at it. He's not as consistent as I would like to see. I think he's more consistent. Now, this is just in college, mind you. I think he's much more consistent at it on film than MVS was last year for the Chiefs. So I think the idea is you get that threat raised up, and then because he's as fast as he is, that tracking ability doesn't matter quite as much, because the idea is if you've got 3 yards of separation as opposed to 1 yard separation, you're a little bit better to just, you're not, you know, fighting off hands. You're able to concentrate a little better. It doesn't matter quite as much. The quarterback's able to just deliver to a general area. I do agree, though, that he did some of his best work underneath, utilizing the threat of his speed. I think he's an underrated route runner. Most people that I've talked to, that's kind of the takeaway they got. Had he run, it's kind of an interesting thing. The running joke that I have with him is, had he run a 4.3 instead of a 4.21, I think a certain crowd would have liked him more, because they would have focused more on other things. He runs pretty good routes. That's why he was productive as a true freshman, and he was able to come in, and that's why his statistical production, that it doesn't really match what you see from other guys who ran these freakish 40-yard dashes like a John Ross, who only had one productive year in college. And so I do agree with that in a sense. I don't think he's great at it, but I don't think he's bad either. And I happen to, the Texas quarterback, I don't know anything about college football. I don't follow it. I only watch guys. But I reviewed Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy because the Chiefs were connected to both for good reason, I think. And I walked away thinking, man, their quarterback left like 1,000 yards on the field between those two guys. And like, I mean, I watched it, and it was bad. Both of them had snaps, Mitchell and Worthy, where they were jumping up and down at the end because they were so open. And so it's a little bit of everything there. I don't think he's great at it. Like, and that's one thing that separated Deshaun Jackson. He could track down a ball on the moon in addition to his speed. I don't think Worthy's at that level, but I don't think it's a weakness either.
So let's go back to a comment you made a little bit earlier because I don't know how familiar you are. You said you're not familiar with college football. I don't know how familiar you are with fantasy in terms of playing, but right now on Underdog Fantasy, which is where the most of the actual like real drafts are going down in best ball drafts.
Sure.
Basically, Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy are getting drafted immediately next to each other. Basically, there's no differentiation whatsoever in the markets between Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy. My guess is you think there should be a pretty significant gap between the two.
I do. I mean, first things first, it's Andy Reid. Rookies, like Rashee Rice, it's so easy to forget because the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. And so people focus on the playoffs, where what you saw was obviously Mahomes and Kelce are the centerpiece of that offense. Then it was Rashee Rice. But that was not the case the first half of the season, really the first 9-10 games. And Andy Reid's always been that way. There aren't a lot of rookies that have come in and been immediately productive in his offense. It's also true that Brown, unless, again, there's always the chance that Worthy comes in and just blows the door off, and that can happen. I love some of the things he does on film. He's got an outside shot at it, but the reality is there's a veteran in-house who hasn't had a crazy productive career. Probably fantasy football owners in particular have been burned by Brown before.
Yes.
And that's, and you know what? That's a very real thing. The health stuff might be a concern, but you really can't take into account, how he looked with Josh Dobbs and then the ghost of Kyler Murray throwing him the ball last year, mostly Dobbs. It just isn't. And I think he had one other quarter. I don't even remember who was throwing him the ball. It was bad. It was like watching some of the college guys half the time. So the thing that we do know about him, though, is that based on the data we have and what I see on film too, he separates versus man, and he does his best work at the intermediate levels of the field, which is where Mahomes loves to throw. Mahomes, for all the hype about his arm, he's a decent deep ball guy. He's not a great one. He doesn't throw an incredible deep ball, even when he's got time to set up in the pocket. And you see him working on it throughout the years. But it's just not what he does best. He can make throws no one else really can make, but in terms of consistency with the deep ball, that's just not his jam. I think Brown is a really good fit for everything that they ask their receivers to do. And there's just so much more polish at this point because Worthy's a rookie. I personally think that it makes sense, especially with Worthy's reputation. I think they'll find ways to get him the ball. They are hyping him up in a way that they haven't hyped up a rookie wide receiver during my time covering the Chiefs in the Andy Reid era, which has been the entire Andy Reid era. They've never, drafted a receiver in the first round. They've never hyped one up quite like this. Even like with Sky Moore and Rashee Rice, the second rounders, it was all very... You didn't see the intentionality by the team, right, to put someone at the forefront of things. You are seeing that with Worthy. Is that always a sure thing? No. But generally speaking, the Chiefs have been pretty intentional about trying to show who their guys are, especially Mahomes' guys on offense. But even more so than that, and this is so dumb, such a silly thing to base things on, but you see Hollywood Brown going to Mavs games with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. You see him working out with Patrick Mahomes. He's in a contract year. I've got every reason to believe that he signed with the Chiefs in a contract year on a 1-year deal based on being told, hey, you're going to be our guy. And his skill set says it. I would put a full round or two, at least, difference between the two of them because I think the target differential will likely be that heavy, at least during the first half of the season, barring something crazy happening with Worthy.
So for the first time in years, Travis Kelce is no longer the first tight end getting drafted. That's now Sam Laporta from the Detroit Lions. And I think you have to understand, obviously, that fantasy football is a regular season game. And
right,
Kelce was just great last year in the regular season as opposed to generational. Do you think that that's an intentional trend from the Chiefs, understanding that right now, what Travis Kelce does in the regular season, it's not going to strengthen his Hall of Fame case. He's getting in. It's not going to strengthen his fame. He's already one of the most famous men walking the planet. It's just about winning. Exactly. It's just about winning rings, right? So is that a valid theory that the Chiefs they're not going to bench him until the playoffs, but is it valid to say, hey, they drafted a tight end this year. They have some young tight ends on the roster. Maybe the snaps come down during the regular season.
If you look at his snap trend, that's been happening for a couple of years. They ever since they drafted Noah Gray, really, they've done a little more rotating as opposed to just bringing in someone in their 12 and 13 stuff. Jared Wiley, he's getting some unfair comparisons to college Kelce because that's just not, college Kelce. You couldn't tell. Yeah, I liked his film, but you couldn't tell that he was going to be what he is because you can't, count on, hey, he's going to develop the best field vision we've ever seen in a tight end like that. You can't scout that. But Wiley he's really big, really fast, accelerates really well, and he kind of has a bit of a downfield threat to him. He actually, athletic profile-wise, he tests a little more athletic than Noah Gray, but he's significantly bigger. I would be surprised if they didn't do it. So last year, Kelce was playing hurt the entire, season. That injury he suffered right out of the gate that had him sitting out that week 1 game, that was lingering throughout, and you could see it. When you'd go to games live, it was so interesting. Anytime he caught a pass, and got tackled, he was not in on the next play. Now that's not a literal every time stat, but it's close. Even a target and just the contact, and you'd see him jogging on and off the field. He was tired. He was shot. He was hurt, and that's why I think it really upset me. Selfishly, when they sat him the final week of the season and he was just shy of 1,000 yards because he was about to have 8 straight. And there's 9 guys that have done that. It's this incredible accomplishment, let alone for a tight end. And they had him sit out. But then when you saw what he looked like in the playoffs and he'd had that additional week, he had actually started to rest, you could see the plan there. I think they'll do something similar this year. Now, I don't think it'll still be him the majority of the snaps. I'm guessing it'll be something like 70%. Yeah. But that is going to lower his role. If Worthy is who they're hoping he is, or even if he's 90% of what they're hoping he is in year 1, he's going to command some targets. Rashee Rice, obviously, once he's back from suspension, is going to command quite a few targets. And obviously Hollywood Brown would have been the best receiver on the Chiefs roster last year by a landslide before. And that's more a testament to how bad the Chiefs wide receiver roster was last year, before Rice emerged at least. So because of all that, I don't know if you've got that same need. Really what happened, the Chiefs had a plan. It didn't pan out at all. And the offense looked, just outside against the Bears, they looked horrendous for much of the season for them. And you saw them playing Kelce, I think, more than they intended, and even though he was hurt. I do think he lost. People talked last year a lot about how he lost a step. Travis Kelce lost that step 3 years ago. He hasn't been nearly as explosive for about 3 years. I didn't think he looked noticeably slower in the playoffs than he has been in previous years. This is just who he is now. But I do think I would be surprised to see him, with 160 targets again or something crazy like that. I do think he'll still be a heavy usage guy. I think he'll probably be more productive than he was last year. And the big thing for that is what we just talked about, the different levers that get pulled. There's a big difference when you've got 2 guys, one guy running a go, another guy running a post down the field, and it's Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown, as opposed to Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Justin Watson. So there should be more room for him to work underneath, especially once Rashee Rice comes back. We'll see what the NFL does. Who knows what the NFL will do? But again, my assumption is probably be about half a season. And when he comes back, there's significantly more assets to pull guys away from Kelce, and teams won't be able to halo him nearly as much as they did last year.
So if Rashee Rice is suspended as we expect, and those 11 personnel sets where we would expect him to be in the slot, which is where he thrived last year, who do you think would step in to fill that void?
If I were the Chiefs, generally speaking, I'd throw Brown in there. He did some of his best work from the slot, at least on film that I saw over the last couple of years. He can run, deep fades, that kind of stuff from the slot, and he's got a pretty good route tree from there. It makes sense. Worthy has plenty of experience from the slot. I think the bigger question for them really will be making sure they've got enough boundary bodies right now, because really their only boundary receiver right now, they've got Justin Watson and Justin Ross, neither of whom are guys that you want to be giving every single snap. That's why I'm all aboard the train of them finding one more guy, but the pickings have become somewhat slim. But I think it'll largely be Hollywood Brown out of the slot with him and with Worthy running, some of those clear routes, I hope his conditioning's good because Andy's going to expect him to show, hey, you willing to pull the defense over and over and over. I think that'll be more Worthy's role early while they have Brown playing in the slot.
Before we let you go, you've been just amazing. We haven't talked about one of the most important players on the team, and that's Isiah Pacheco, obviously, who started to do a little bit more in the passing game. It was of the check down variety. I don't think you design it. You could design a screen here and there. Obviously, Andy Reid is notorious for his screen design. But this is a guy who caught 10 passes in the final 2 games of the season, the AFC Championship and the Super Bowl. And they didn't do anything at running back this offseason. I mean, you bring back Edwards-Helaire, Keontae Ingram's there. I guess the rugby player, Reese Zammit, who's going to be an interesting player to watch in training camp. But is it fair to expect Isiah Pacheco, 250 carries, 60 targets? Are we looking at a bell cow here now for the Chiefs?
The Chiefs have always had a higher opinion of Clyde Edwards-Helaire than most. Ever since, his first year, when some of his there's just a ceiling when you lack a certain amount of burst, and he had just enough to get him through in college, but that 0.2 of a second faster in the pros has just been fatal for him. Not in terms, he's a useful player. And he does come out of the backfield at times. It seems like they plan on having him slide a little bit into the Jet McKinnon role. But Pacheco, you would think, would see an increase. You make a really good observation there that most of Pacheco's targets, there were some screens for sure, but there were a lot of checkdowns too. The thing that's interesting about that is it demonstrates a certain amount of trust that Mahomes has developed in him as a receiver, as a checkdown option, being in the right spot at the right time. It also shows that he's on the field more for passing downs. I think we'll see his usage tick up a bit, but I don't think a ton. I think the Chiefs like Clyde, and I think they'll continue to do that. The snaps they're going to miss from Jet McKinnon, who kind of lost a step last year. You could see that. Still really smart, really good in pass pro, knew where to be, but he just didn't have it anymore in terms of the burst that he needed with the type of player he is, weighing $170 soaking wet. And so I think you'll see Pacheco's role grow, but I would be surprised to see Andy go to a full-time bell cow. I think they're counting on one of the young guys to step in and be able to provide, 5 snaps a game, give or take.
Seth Kaiser is the writer of the Chief in the North Substack newsletter, and of course, he is on the Only Weird Games podcast with the Kansas City Sports Network. He is an attorney by trade, and then an analyst by night and by hobby. And I would suggest he kind of flip those on their head, quite frankly, because you will not learn more about the Kansas City Chiefs from anyone out there. I mean, even if you had Andy Reid in your living room, he's probably not giving away the trade secrets. So you can follow Seth on Twitter at RealMN, like the abbreviation for Minnesota, Chiefs fan, and make sure you subscribe to the Chief in the North Substack newsletter if you're interested in this analysis. Seth, it's been wonderful having you on the Franchise Focus. Thanks for everything, my man. It was wonderful talking Chiefs with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.